really is a great sign of how far the Overton window has shifted some of the language in these bills. But the fact that like in half of the states in America, there are people that are supporting the idea of public investment in Bitcoin, and they're talking about Bitcoin as a hedge against monetary debasement, that's an incredibly powerful sign that the message is getting out there.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Frank Corva here, the political correspondent for Bitcoin Magazine. I'm here speaking with Zack Shapiro today. Zack is an attorney, a managing partner at Raines Law Firm, and the head of policy at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. I wanted to have Zack on to talk a little bit more about something that he proposed, I believe it was last week, at the Bitcoin Policy Institute's Bitcoin for America Summit, which was this open source template for how states might approach establishing their SBRs or their strategic Bitcoin reserves. But before we get into that, Zack, if you want to give a little bit more of an introduction about yourself and just let us know a little bit more about yourself and then we'll dive in.
Well, thanks for having me. My name is Zack Shapiro. I sort of wear two hats in the Bitcoin space. I run a small law firm called Raines LLP, and we represent a bunch of different Bitcoin startups and investors trying to help grow the ecosystem of people building in and around Bitcoin. And then I'm the head of policy at BPI, which is a Bitcoin-focused think tank based in DC. We hosted the summit last week around the idea of strategic reserves in general and what does good policy look like. My role at BPI is to really think through what does good policy, public policy around Bitcoin look like? What are the most important issues and what stance sort of representing the various stakeholders in the Bitcoin network do we want to advocate for in Washington, D.C. and around the country?
Very cool. Appreciate that. Thank you. So let's dive right in. So in your speech at the event, at the Bitcoin for America event, you called Bitcoin a financial lifeboat. And you said that there's this window for adoption that's before us. It's quite historic, but it's not indefinite. It's not going to be eternally open to sort of maybe, let's just to say it in layperson's terms, maybe to start acquiring Bitcoin at such prices. And, this is something that I think that individuals, companies, and governments should all be thinking about. Why have you chosen to focus on the state level adoption area of this?
Yeah, great question. So look, in general, BPI focuses more at the federal level. That's just true. I mean, a lot of, especially both the threats and opportunities, but especially the threats that face Bitcoin more come from the federal government than come from the states, specifically questions around, money transmitter status and how do people interact with the Bitcoin network really fall under federal law. And in the past, I think I've been pretty publicly skeptical about state efforts in general having to do with Bitcoin, right? I'm not really necessarily in favor of Bitcoin state bills of rights. I think the federal constitution protects Bitcoin. And so most of our policy is at the federal level. Now, one of the sort of few exceptions to this, I think, is the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which is a policy measure I think is quite valuable at the state level in addition to and distinct from the federal SBR, both that we got by executive order and that we would like to pass through Cynthia Lummis's Bitcoin Act. States have financial obligations. They have budgets. They have assets they need to manage. And Bitcoin is at least as powerful a tool for the states as it is for the federal government. And so, I think that this state policy makes a ton of sense. And so, while I wouldn't say I focus on the states that much in general, I think this is a worthy initiative that's got a lot of attention at the federal level. And, I'm sure we'll get into it. We did some research on the existing state proposals having to do with public investment in Bitcoin, found most of them quite lacking. And so sort of want to provide sort of a more professional template for state SBRs with input from the industry and people who've have experience drafting such things.
Amazing. Appreciate that. And we surely will dig into that a little bit more. But before we do that, could we do a little bit more of a higher level overview of why a state level SBR or how a state level SBR would differ from a federal SBR? So there's sort of states and the federal government, there's sort of a different relationship to the money printer, if I'm not mistaken. So if you could tell us a little bit about the main difference between the two types of SBRs, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. So when we talk about differentiating the state SBRs from the federal SBR, I think there are sort of two ways in which they might differ. One is the need for them, and the other is the implementation. So starting with the need, at some base level, anyone who holds Bitcoin needs Bitcoin for the same reason, right? It's that the sort of fundamental, way of using money is broken. right? Our money, at least in the United States, the dollar is a very convenient unit of account to price things in. It's a very convenient medium of exchange to buy things, especially when you use banking rails. It's not a good store of value, and so American people individually, American companies, American states, and the federal government to some extent have to get in the business. I mean, less the federal government, but have to be in the business of being money managers, even if that's not their core expertise. And
Right.
so, states have long-term obligations like pension plans. Um, they need to be able to have assets to pay those out. Treasury bills are probably not going to keep up long term, or any sort of dollar denominated debt is not going to keep up long term with the amount of payouts that people will need to live in retirement, or disability, or any of the other situations where states will have to pay out. And so states are forced into buying securities, buying other assets that have different risk profiles, but really aren't fine-tuned to be a long-term store of value in the way that Bitcoin is. And
Right.
I think, Michael Saylor sort of put this best, that Bitcoin sort of has the lowest level of entropy. It is designed for long-term preservation of capital. And so it's an incredibly powerful tool for states in the same way it is for the federal government or for individuals. But states in particular, not having direct access to the money printer and not having access to perpetual deficit spending in the way that the federal government more is, because of the ability to issue government bonds and the dollar being the world's reserve currency. This is a more acute problem for the states, and so matching up their assets with their long-term liabilities is a really difficult problem, for which Bitcoin is a seems almost custom built solution. And I that's the reason we used Lifeboat. It really is sort of a lifeboat to this very difficult problem. So that's in terms of the need for state SBRs.
Yeah.
In terms of
Appreciate.
implementation, um,
Please.
for the federal government, I think the opportunity is to take a really big slug at buying Bitcoin, holding Bitcoin on the federal balance sheet, and analogies to the Louisiana Purchase or other like really large scale projects to secure sort of American geopolitical dominance. Um, for states, states are probably not going to have the buying power to do that, and so implementation may look like the federal SBR as envisioned by the president's executive order or the Bitcoin Act, and it might be a standalone reserve of Bitcoin that are purchased either with taxpayer funds, diversified sort of pre-existing state assets, or other sort of revenue or budget neutral items. Or it might look a bit different, right? It might be something that the term strategic Bitcoin reserve makes less sense than the more generic term public investment in Bitcoin. It might be that states take a look at their pre-existing pension plans and the asset that those hold, and they say, all right, Bitcoin has a different volatility profile, different liquidity profile, a different long-term outlook than the other assets we're holding, and we want to be able to mix Bitcoin in either directly in our custody or through other state instruments, to be able to sort of preserve value in the long term. And in those cases, I think it's a little bit less important that we have this sort of full maximalist large purchase of Bitcoin held exactly in cold storage and managed in this way for the long term than it is at the federal level, which we really want that to be a more direct strategic sort of planting the flag in Bitcoin for the
Yeah.
United States.
Okay. Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you. And we'll dive a little bit more, into the nuance and also cold storage and how that's managed, how much is kept in cold storage, how much might be used, before, compared to, I think in the Bitcoin Act, it says that the government will hold it for at least 20 years, whether or not the states will take a similar approach. But first, I think in your talk, you mentioned that there have been 32 bills proposed across 24 states as of right now. And these bills are broadly about Bitcoin and crypto adoption, not necessarily just about a Bitcoin SBR. At face value, this seems promising. However, you said in the speech that there have been quote unquote lackluster efforts to get these bills across the finish line. So where are you getting this information, and what do these lackluster efforts look like?
Yeah. So where am I getting this information? I too had, when I was asked to do a speech about state level adoption of Bitcoin reserves, I'd seen a lot of stuff on Twitter, like a lot of the listeners probably have, about how bullish this is and how far along it is. And sort of assumed that the states were, again, BPI doesn't really focus much on the states. So this wasn't something I had my ear to the ground as much. I assumed that these were legit and way advanced compared to the federal government. And then I had to, I read all of these bills, and both from a policy and politics standpoint, it's not a great situation. So from a the policy side, a lot of these bills are like super short, right?
Mm.
For example, the furthest along bills at this point are Arizona and Texas, I believe. And these bills are like 1, 2, 3 pages, right? The
Okay.
versions we're moving forward. They say, listen, one version is that the state investment plans may invest up to 10% of their assets in Bitcoin. It doesn't call for investment. It doesn't, have adequate definitions. It doesn't have adequate discussion of, how are these things held, under what circumstances could it be sold. Um, it really seems more like we want to say something supportive of Bitcoin, and we want to leave it at that. So
Got it.
some of the statistics I referenced in my speech, of all of those bills, right? None have been enacted. None of the bills that are proposed on the sort of state reserve tracker, even if they were enacted, would immediately cause Bitcoin to be purchased, right? It in best case, it just authorizes the state to buy X amount of Bitcoin. The large majority of those bills are not Bitcoin only. Many of them, including some of the furthest along ones, include NFTs in the assets you can put in this reserve, which would be, imagine the state buying up a bunch of, bored apes and pudgy penguins. That doesn't seem like great policy. Um, a lot of them are just really short, and they don't make sense. And so, I think there is really room to step up our game there. Now, why did this happen? Look, Bitcoiners, I think, look at the world in terms of incentives. That's what makes Bitcoin work. And I think we have a little bit of a failed incentive problem here, where, especially in states that have like very partisan one party or the other legislatures, you have people who sort of want to get attention, and maybe they're, freshman state, congressmen or senators, and they want to make a name for themselves, and they don't really know much about Bitcoin or crypto, but they want to be seen as supportive. And
Right.
then I think, this is something probably we should be more careful about in the Bitcoin industry. There are people who really want to make a name for themselves, in the Bitcoin booster, Bitcoin policy arena, who anything that looks like a win on Twitter is a win, and we don't need to look too close to the details. And it's more important to break news than get good policy across. So, um, I think there is an opportunity here. Once I read these bills, both for BPI to get involved, we've got really smart drafting folks, and we like
Yep.
thinking deeply about these questions, and really to make this into a community effort to think carefully about what would a good state Bitcoin bill look like, whether that's creating a standalone strategic Bitcoin reserve, or whether that is just enacting some form of public investment in Bitcoin to make sure states that are diversifying some of their assets into something that is purpose built for long-term preservation of wealth.
Very cool. And I'll have to push back. I really thought that X was, or Twitter was, real life. So yeah. Anyway, so the other side to this, when it comes to something like Bitcoin, so people at the state level, you're talking about these Bitcoin boosters, are people who sort of see Bitcoin as a hot topic in government in general right now, and now they're coming around saying they're sort of pro Bitcoin. With something like Bitcoin, I don't think it's too difficult to get this message across that there's only 21 million, that it's digital gold. Some of the basic metaphors or the basic information about Bitcoin that we tend to use, or analogies that we use. Um, in terms of the educational efforts, how difficult do you think it's going to be to sort of explain to people that, there's only going to be this window, as you put it, and that as game theory plays out and more states and nation states adopt this, we sort of need to move quickly? How do we sort of, make this an imperative, as you put it?
Yeah, I mean, pardon my language. The answer is incredibly fucking difficult, right? I mean, look, the people who are listening to this are in a special, weird group of people who've put in a ton of time to understand Bitcoin, and we take a lot of stuff for granted. But
Mm,
yeah, it's easy to understand that there are 21 million Bitcoin. It's really hard to understand why that's important or how big a deal that is
right.
until you've really sort of like, there are almost no like, almost everyone in Bitcoin is neuroatypical in some way, because the amount of focus you need to just rock this. And it's really hard, right? You have to understand the technological aspect of like, how does Bitcoin work, and why is it not going to break? And why was the Bybit hack the other week not proof that like anyone can hack into Bitcoin? You
Right.
need to understand the historical context for like, what is money, and what sort of commodity assets have humans tried to use as money, and what like features of those assets make them more or less successful, and why is Bitcoin sort of the best endpoint in this evolution. You have to understand what is the history of Bitcoin itself, right? Why is Bitcoin incredibly scarce as opposed to other cryptocurrencies, right? Understanding
Right.
like the difference between the outcome of the block size wars and the user activated soft fork, and the sort of Bitcoin grassroots community showing that it had the power over the moneyed interest of the exchange and the miners, et cetera, versus, for example, the aftermath of the DAO hack in Ethereum, where the insiders had the clout to roll back the blockchain and change the rules and fork off Ethereum Classic. And uh, to someone who's not really steeped in that, which is almost everybody is not totally steeped in that. Bitcoin looks like a Ponzi scheme. It's not backed
Right.
by anything. You can always create a new Bitcoin. Anyone can create so just saying the talking points that Bitcoiners like of there's 21 million, like that's not sufficient. That might be sufficient to have people feel like they're saying something supportive of Bitcoin.
Okay.
That's definitely not sufficient to get it. So
Okay.
I think if we're going to succeed and we're going to have people vote, especially across party lines to for these bills, for what looks to a lot of their constituents like an insane thing to do, taking their like real assets in real companies and diversifying it into magic internet money. I
Yeah.
mean, a good mental model for people listening. Think about how you would feel if your state was going to take taxpayer dollars and throw them into meme coins or NFTs. That's probably how most people feel about this. The
Yep.
the educational lift is really big.
Okay.
And again, this is something like we understand this mission at BPI. That's what we're here for, is to educate policymakers. But like, let's not kid ourselves about how hard this is.
Okay. Yeah, appreciate that. It's good perspective. I do think that many of us who are down the proverbial Bitcoin rabbit hole, we sort of forget that the rest of the world is not really paying attention to the extent that we are. And even the whatever it is, 4% of the world that might own some Bitcoin or whatever, it doesn't mean that they're doing their homework hardcore on this. Even if that were the case, that's still only 4% of the world or whatever that number is. So let's talk about a state that got actually kind of close to passing legislation. I think Utah almost got there with some legislation. I'm not sure if that was around an SBR. If you could talk a little bit about what that legislation looked like, and then what happened at the final hour that made it not pass.
Yeah, the Utah legislation was interesting. It was really broad. I don't know, like certainly not in the form it passed, but even before it was edited, whether you'd call it an SBR bill or not is like an
Hmm.
interesting question. It did a whole bunch of things. It affirmed a bunch of people's rights to use Bitcoin, which I'll be honest, like I think I think I mentioned before, I think potentially counterproductive. Right? I think Bitcoin bills of rights are counterproductive to the broader argument we want to make that the federal constitution protects your right to custody Bitcoin, to use the
Right.
Bitcoin network, right? Like there's First Amendment protections potentially, there's Fourth, Fifth Amendment protections, 14th Amendment, unenumerated power protections. Even Jason Lowry makes some interesting arguments about the Second Amendment. But regardless, like we think that these are federal rights people have. But there's a lot of that in the Utah bill. There was a lot of interesting stuff prohibiting Utah municipalities from not allowing mining. I don't know if that's great policy or not. I mean,
Hmm.
it's sort of like I'm very pro Bitcoin mining. I think it has great externalities for the environment when you're capturing flared gas or incentivizing stranded renewable
Yep.
utilization. It's great for balancing power grids. But if a municipality doesn't want to have Bitcoin mining, I feel like there's a risk of a backlash if a state legislature is going to say no, you can't do that. And then there was it allowed some specific Utah public funds to diversify into Bitcoin. That part of it was stripped out at the last moment. It got passed without that part. And so I don't think anyone is, even the sort of like Bitcoin laws tracker online, disqualified that from winning the sort of state reserves race.
Okay.
Um, but look, it's telling. We were just talking about the education point and how hard it is going to be to sell it to people if we're being realistic about it. I think one really good sign of that is like it was a deal breaker for a bill that was on the cusp of being passed into law in Utah, where it was quite a popular bill. They had to remove the public investment part to get it through.
Got it.
There just is going to be resistance.
Okay, understood. In your opinion, which is the first state to get something across the finish line? I have my opinions. Curious to hear yours.
I mean, the two furthest along on paper, I think, are Arizona and Texas right now.
Texas, right? Yeah.
Um,
Right. Okay.
probably one of those two.
There was some footage. I think it was from the Bitcoin Law handle. They reposted some footage. I guess it was broadcasted on a local channel. It seemed like the two representatives that were, in front of, I guess, the legislative body speaking about this, seemed to really know their stuff. Talking about Bitcoin as a flight to safety, which was kind of wild to hear. Is that some of the posturing you were talking about? People just sort of all of a sudden becoming bullish on Bitcoin, or do you think that there are a few people in government in these states that really do get it and are trying to push this message to the states?
Yeah, I think there's both. I mean,
Okay.
look, I've been shitting on the state bills a little bit, and I think rightfully so. But the upside of this, and I think I mentioned this at the summit last week, is that it really is a great sign of how far the Overton window has shifted. Like some of the language in these bills and some
Yep.
of the language people are using to promote them. Right? I wish that the bills were better crafted, but the fact that like in half of the states in America, there are people that are supporting the idea of public investment in Bitcoin. And specifically, even if the bill doesn't call for specifically Bitcoin, they are specifically talking about Bitcoin, and they're talking about Bitcoin as a hedge against monetary debasement.
Right.
That's an incredibly powerful sign that the message is getting out there. Now,
Yeah.
is it getting out there fully to all of the folks we need to pass it? Maybe, maybe not. But it's not seen as crazy to talk about this, at least. And that I think, like, we shouldn't underestimate. Like, that is a great sign. And like, one thing I am grateful to the sort of existing state efforts is getting the word out. And now we just need to channel that enthusiasm into like something actionable.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, sounds good. We obviously have the federal government taking the lead here. We have the EO, we have the Bitcoin Act that's proposed both in the Senate and in the House, proposed by Senator Lummis in the Senate and Congressman Begich in the House. Super exciting stuff. And you've talked about this idea of what the states end up developing and what the federal government ends up developing being complementary, maybe some symbiosis, sharing information in your mind, or sharing like best practices on how to establish these and maintain them. In your mind, what does some of that sharing look like? How often are the states speaking with the federal government about this? Is there sort of a body that keeps everybody up to speed on best practices? What does this look like?
I think there are a number of ways this could look. One interesting way is if you look at the text of the Bitcoin Act, it actually has a provision for voluntary state participation in the federal strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
so the federal government, will invest all of this, time and resources into creating sort of geographically separated multi-sig custody for the federal SBR, and will maintain for states segregated accounts where states can enter an agreement with the government, like, here's the access protocol, here's what can be spent, et cetera. And then you can actually use the federal SBR envisioned by the Bitcoin Act for state Bitcoin treasuries.
Okay.
So I think that's one great way to have coordination and not duplicate efforts and piggyback on the resources of the federal government.
Yeah.
Short of that, coordinating the way these laws work to be able to share information, share best practices. I mean, I think step one might be this sort of model legislation that we're hoping multiple states can use, and then they can learn from each other. If a couple states pass it, then other states can use that language, and they can coordinate that way. Other things to coordinate on, obviously, sort of custody best practices, whether that's self custody using a qualified custodian or something like that, or holding securities of some sort. If states are going to use things like ETFs, maybe they can use sort of strength in numbers to negotiate better terms, lower fees. But this is something that's new, right? Like,
Yeah.
holding Bitcoin sort of for long-term wealth preservation is a inherently 21st century activity, and it's best not to go about it alone, right? Just like most Bitcoiners shouldn't roll their own custody totally from scratch. I think states could benefit from each other. One thing to note, when it's not out yet, but when we release this model legislation, we intend for it to be very modular, rather than a one size fits all.
Hmm.
So there are going to be lots of different parts of it, right? How much money will be allocated to Bitcoin? Is there a standalone strategic reserve versus diversification of existing state funds into Bitcoin?
Okay.
What kind of proof of reserves will there be? Should there be some sort of insurance for assets held by states? We're looking to have basically like bracketed menu items that we'll put where we'll make ourselves available and representatives of the Bitcoin community available to state legislatures, and be like, listen, here's a menu of options. Think about what works best for your state. And it's sort of like a famous, in law school, they talk about states as the laboratories of democracy. And part of
Mm.
the way that, the constitutional and federalist framework is supposed to work is states can try out different laws, can try out different models of governance. And then, hopefully those best practices filter out to other states and then filter up to the federal government. And so, I'd be very interested to see states try different approaches to SBRs, and then the best practices can arise from that naturalistic experiment where different states are doing different things.
Yeah, very cool. And I think you just sort of alluded to it, but you've talked about what you're creating, and so let's dive a little bit into what that is. So, what you termed an open source blueprint for state level SBRs. This is something that you're looking to unveil at a Bitcoin Policy Institute summit in June, I think in late June. So, can you give us sort of the high level view of what this blueprint might look like, and also maybe comment on the fact that it's open source and why?
Yeah. So high level, it is a framework for here are all the things that you need to think about if you're doing a state level reserve. Really working
Okay.
from first principles and making sure that like we've thought through each piece and this is being done in a thorough and careful way. Next, like I said, modular. We want to give states options, right? It shouldn't be a one size fits all. Now, third, what those modular options are is going to be language that we have thought through and that we've talked to counsel about and that we think is workable. Since the beginning of the new administration, one of the really big pieces of feedback we've gotten from policymakers at basically all levels of government is they are tired of the Bitcoin and crypto community giving them high level frameworks. They are up to their eyeballs in
Interesting.
policy ideas and frameworks. What they want is like language that can be implemented. Um,
Mm,
right? Like, and so we really want to do our homework and make sure that we are providing not just it would be nice if there were proofs of reserves, but like no, here is the text that you should put in the bill if you want to do proof of reserves, stating exactly how it will work and removing the guesswork. And again, like really trying to be actionable rather
yeah.
than just sort of like symbolically supportive. So yeah, some of the things that will be on that list, right? Custody, how Bitcoin is bought. Is it bought in a lump sum? Is it DCA over time? In either case, are the purchases denominated in dollars? Or are they denominated in Bitcoin, like Bitcoin Act
Mm,
is? How will the execution work for those purchases? What kind of assets will be bought? Is it directly Bitcoin? Is it some sort of convertible instrument that becomes real Bitcoin? Is it a Bitcoin security like a share of an ETF?
mm,
Those are all options that states will need to face. Custody, right? Self custody versus a custodian. That's a question. Is it standalone? Is it in a pre-existing fund?
right.
Lots of different questions and options that we want to provide language for.
Okay. And by making it open source, so I think you never know who can contribute to something that's open source, which is the beauty of open source. But I would imagine you probably have maybe some people, groups, institutions in mind that might be that maybe you hope will contribute to it. So what goes through your mind in terms of once you put this out there and say, hey, we're open to feedback, we're open to people to contribute to this. Who do you think will come out of the woodwork to do so?
Yeah. So I think there are three reasons to open source this. One is a political reason, which is that sort of, and again, like BPI is a think tank, a nonprofit think tank that represents Bitcoin. We are not an industry trade group. Nevertheless, industry trade groups kind of have a bad name for drafting model legislation.
Okay.
This is a long-standing thing where the oil industry will draft bills that are good for the oil industry, and these things are done sort of in closed, smoky rooms, and they are regarded with suspicion.
Okay.
We want this to be the opposite of that, right? Just like the Bitcoin network is open source, and that's why people trust it. It's done out in the open. That's how we want to do this framework, and it's not us having secret meetings. It's like, listen, here's our thinking about what the best options are for state investment in Bitcoin.
Okay.
Second, I mentioned this in my speech. I really think we want this to be a maximum community effort to the extent possible. So we are actually hoping that specifically Bitcoin companies who are experts in some domain of the Bitcoin stack, whether that's like a market maker or prime broker that really understands execution, can help states think through, all right, how do you get the best price in the Bitcoin you're buying, right? Collaborative custody companies, right, that help people hold their Bitcoin in multi-sig storage, can help states think through what self-custody is like, right?
Yep.
Proof of reserves companies can help states with proof of reserves attestations. So we want to really bring together sort of the Avengers squad of people that understand how Bitcoin works to contribute specifically to helping states navigate this really new and important tool. And then third, states are very different from one another, right? There are 50 states. They each have their own unique sort of legal situation. They each have their own unique budgetary situation. And, we want to put some good ideas out there, but we have no pride of ownership about what eventually gets passed. We just want good laws to get passed. And so if states want to take what we put out there and then just edit it to meet their specific situation and they don't like some of the wording we have and they want to do something different or it doesn't fit, that's great, right? And so we want to give the maximum ability for states to do that. And so having it be open source, having it be like, listen, this is a starting point, this is what we think good policy around state reserves could look like, and then people can take it and run with it from there. I think that sort of best accomplishes that goal.
Okay. Very, very cool. In terms of, let's go back to maybe cold storage a little bit there, and you talking a little bit about how maybe it's not just all held in like the deepest, coldest storage that there is, right? And also this idea of maybe referencing industry professionals. So I think it was last week I did a fireside chat with Nick Newman, who's the CEO of Casa, and we dove in a little bit to what a digital Fort Knox looks like. That's the language in the EO that Trump signed about the SBR. Um, it was surprising to hear him say that this is something that really needs to be carefully considered. The process does, even in terms of key generation, in terms of how many wallets get created, how many signers there are for each of these wallets, the geographical distributing of the keys or the shards of the keys. Just in your mind, let's just take an average state. Are they creating multiple wallets? What sort of multi-signature setup are they using? How much remains in like a semi-hot wallet versus a totally deep cold storage wallet? All of that kind of stuff. What are just some preliminary thoughts that you have about that?
Yeah, I think that is entirely contingent on what the purpose of the reserve is. If the idea, again, to keep using this example of like you've got a firefighter state pension fund and you want to diversify into Bitcoin, maybe self custody isn't the right answer, right?
Okay.
And right, maybe you want to hold the Bitcoin with a custodian, or maybe you want to hold ETF shares where that Bitcoin is being held with a custodian. And the idea is you sell over time to meet some pre-existing obligation. If, however, the goal is we're putting a stake in the ground for the state, we want to hold some amount of Bitcoin indefinitely, and maybe we can lend against this, or we can borrow against this Bitcoin, right?
Mm,
And be able to issue state Bitcoin bonds of some sort. Then it's the opposite. Is what you want to be your like custody as credible over the long term as humanly possible. Um, and then you really probably do want something like a geographically separated multisig, which is currently the state of the art. Although there are other options I think that will make custody safer even over the long term. So today, companies like Liana and AnchorWatch are tinkering with Miniscript, which is a tool that's available
yep.
today to create more robust multi-sig custody solutions. If we have a soft fork of Bitcoin that includes something like covenants, that could be another really powerful tool for sort of long-term custody that mitigates threats to cold storage.
Yep.
But regardless, like if states are going to embark on this, we're doing cold storage for the long term. It's really hard and it's really easy to screw up. And as the developers would say, there are lots of foot guns. And so, there's so many parts of this that need to be done carefully, both designing what that custody looks like, but then executing on some parts of this. There's a really old episode of I think it's Radio Lab, the podcast, where they have a reporter part of the Zcash key ceremony for the creation of the privacy
Whoa.
token Zcash, and just like the level of I've been involved in a couple of Bitcoin companies that have sort of an analogous thing for their sort of corporate treasury keys. uh it's really intense, right? You got to like generate the keys in a Faraday cage room. There are all sorts of like procedures that you need to undertake. And so some
Yep.
states, I think for your average state, they're just not going to have people in the state government probably who are expert in that. So I think the options then become either you work with a company, right? Whether that is a Bitcoin custody specific company or some sort of like cybersecurity company that really knows what they're doing to help design really secure custody protocols at the state level, both that like are secure and that people in the state government are able to use, right? Because if you have really good custody
Right.
that nobody knows how to operate, that's not great either.
Yep.
Or you need coordination with the federal government, and you use some mechanism like the Bitcoin Act to have sort of a digital Fort Knox for the federal government, which we're going to have anyway because of the executive order, that states might be able to take advantage of and lean on the many experts on cryptography we have at the NSA and NIST, like at the federal level, who I think are very capable of coming up with robust custody structures.
Very cool. All right. Appreciate that perspective. In terms of transparency, what do you envision? So an El Salvador sort of model where we're just publicizing the public address of the holding, one public address, multiple public addresses. How transparent do you think states should be, and how should they go about this?
So I think it's up to the states, right? I don't know sure I want to prescribe one answer. And again, I would sort of default back to like fit for purpose. Um,
Yep.
for regular funds, if it's ETF shares, you probably do the same reporting that you do for other assets. If it's a long term, like this is an important sort of strategic move for a state, and we want everyone to be absolutely sure that we have this Bitcoin, then definitely I think you need some sort of like cryptographic proof of reserves attestation. Um, Right,
Interesting.
because the state, like if it sort of issues state level bonds or something, like you're going to need to be able to have investors have like full confidence that there is the Bitcoin to back this, that it's, it's not lost and it's not otherwise encumbered or subject to, cyber attack or something like that.
Okay. And speaking of the bonds that we talked about, so Andrew Hones of New Market Capital spoke at this the Bitcoin for America event, gave an absolutely stunning presentation. Just the math he's worked out on BitBonds. It was just absolutely incredible. I believe that's up on the Bitcoin Policy Institute's website, on their YouTube channel. So please go check that out. It's very interesting that you bring up this idea of issuing the bonds at the state level. When I spoke with Andrew after that talk, he was just like, I hope to get in front of our Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent. Um, I hadn't thought about that at the state level. Is this something you're hearing, or are you just sort of proposing this, putting it out into the ether to see if maybe it sticks somewhere? Do you think it's a reality at the state level that states do this?
Look, I think it will. I think it's sort of an inevitable reality. If there are states that decide they want to have long term Bitcoin reserves, right, that they are holding in deep cold storage, right, and if Bitcoin appreciates in the way that probably most listeners right now think it will appreciate, uh, you're probably not going to want to sell it. But you might want to financialize it. You might want to use some of it as working capital. And so
Yep.
the type of Bitbond you would issue to get equity out of the Bitcoin is different than the type of Bitbonds that we might use to accumulate Bitcoin at the federal level, or that we might use to sort of create a Bitcoin kicker on treasury bills over the long term. So I think this might be a different type of Bitbond, but like in the event that states end up with large Bitcoin reserves, I'm sure that like debt will be part of the equation. I think another really interesting part, though, of Andrew's work in particular, that's super relevant to this question about state level reserves is the case of states that may not want to do a standalone SBR, a standalone Bitcoin reserve. They want to do blending Bitcoin into other investment funds. And, I think Andrew's work through Battery is really interesting in thinking of Bitcoin as a really good type of mixed collateral, right?
Hmm.
It pairs well with real estate, it pairs well with debt. And, Bitcoin, aside from having sort of fundamental attributes as money that make it a good asset, it also has attributes as an asset in terms of the way it trades, that's liquid 24/7, that it
Yep.
is at this point in time quite volatile, that it is very divisible and you can sell pieces of it, that it's just great collateral that you can put in a vault that makes it easy to liquidate. And these attributes, I think, can really, be useful in thinking about, all right, what is the treasury, what is the basket of assets a state might want to hold for the long term, specifically to meet like known fixed obligations in the future.
Right.
And so, I definitely, very curious to collaborate with Andrew to think through what could those investment programs look like other than just a standalone sort of, simple SBR where we're holding Bitcoin forever. How do we think about Bitcoin mixed with other assets to meet long-term obligations?
Okay, very cool. Do you think also? So, what comes to mind as we're discussing this too is a conversation I had with, I think it was Joe Kelly, one of the founders of Unchained, and they offer a financial product where they teach people how to hold their private keys for an IRA. And he said, it's a really great thing because it really gives people a much better idea of what Bitcoin is. And I think that as states go through this process and they really learn what Bitcoin is, what it takes to secure it, what they can do with it, all of that stuff, do you think that there's potential that people embrace it, and that we do see more things like maybe de minimis tax exemptions, for people who are using it more? Does this lead to other sorts of pro Bitcoin legislation? Is this just a good start, maybe the state level SBRs?
Yeah, it certainly could. And I think there's also a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing where, yes, I think it will have some of those positive knock-on effects, but also we probably need people to start to understand and accept it to get some of these things passed in a robust way, right? So
Right.
it's all sort of rowing in the same direction. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these sort of policy questions you're talking about are more federal questions. Like if states want to give you de minimis sales tax exemption or whatever, if you still have to record, a $7 purchase to the IRS, like how much good does that do you as
Right.
a
Right.
taxpayer? But even on the issues that are more at the federal level, having states sort of lead the way on policy can be useful. I mean, we're seeing, one example is like the Overton window shift on pot legalization, right? Where that really
Right.
did come from the state level and seems to be trickling up to the federal level. So it's all positive. I do think there will probably be some of these good knock on effects. But I think really mostly this is like states need good long term assets. Bitcoin is the perfect long term asset to meet state liabilities. And yeah, it's great that there's all this collateral stuff, but the states I think stand a lot to benefit just from holding Bitcoin.
Okay. Very cool. And so you mentioned that you're going to roll out this open source template for adoption by June. That gives you a few months to work with here. I'm just kind of curious, what do you foresee? Who do you foresee speaking with between now and then? What are you planning to do to sort of get the initial draft out there to the public?
Yeah, everyone I can. Just in terms of like the way I think about this workflow, what we're doing now is sort of stripping everything down to first principles, and being like, all right, what's just the list of things that you need in a good state reserve bill, right? And making sure, all right, we've got this outline of like, here's all the stuff that we may or may not want to include, right? Here are the options that we should have. Then, okay, where is there good precedent? So we'll spoiler alert, we'll definitely take a bunch of language from the Bitcoin Act, which I think is the best drafted
Okay.
of the SBR bills. And so where, Senator Lummis and Connor have done really good, careful work, like we will plagiarize that. And then sort of the remaining stuff where like there will be some of it that we'll want to think about from scratch, and have BPI come up with suggestions. And then there will be other parts of the bill where we want subject matter expertise. And that might come from Bitcoin companies like we've talked about, right? Where it's touching on some aspect of their business that they're an expert on. And some of it might come from state legislators or people that are more in the weeds on sort of state budgets and state politics and what is it that's actually practical for a state that's considering this, as opposed to sort of like pie in the sky what a Bitcoiners want from a symbolic perspective.
Right.
We'll talk to everyone that we can, but I think specifically input from Bitcoin companies, input from people who work in state government. Those are the two categories that seem no brainers.
Amazing. Well, very cool. Anything else on this that we didn't cover? I do want to touch a little bit on the P2P rights fund, which I'll get into in just a moment. But is there anything else regarding state level SBRs that we didn't touch on that you'd like to mention?
No, I think this was like a good conversation, and thank you for being so thorough here. I think this is an important topic and sort of undercovered.
No, I appreciate it. My main impetus in doing this was because I saw you speak at the event. You only got about 7 minutes to speak, and it was a great sort of introduction. But I was genuinely curious to know more. What you packed into that 7 minutes was great. It was sort of a lot of here's what's coming. I was quite intrigued, so it's nice to hear you unpack this a little bit. So we appreciate that. Just on a quick note, though, just given that we just saw the fourth pretrial hearing for the Samurai case. And also today we got really cool news. Tornado Cash is no longer on the OFAC sanction list, according to, or the US Treasury has taken it off that
Yep.
list. Super, super exciting stuff. So while this is a little bit off topic, I think it's still relevant in terms of the Bitcoin and sort of private transactional privacy space. If you could touch just a little bit on your thoughts on maybe what happened this week regarding the Samurai case, what just happened with the Tornado Cash case, and then we'll touch on the P2P rights fund after that.
Yeah, so this week there's a status conference in the Samurai case. Not a huge amount of substantive change, other than there's now a briefing schedule for what are going to be two types of motions. So in a criminal case, you have pretrial motions where people say to the judge, in advance of the trial, we want to either, in a criminal case, the defense will often say, we want you to dismiss some of the charges because even if we take everything the government is alleging to be true, and, the government's just alleging it, they need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury. But even if, like, the jury were to find all of the facts you say, this actually doesn't amount to a crime. So as a matter of law, you, the judge, should dismiss these charges. And then there's a huge amount of evidence in this case, right? Any sort of electronic criminal case that there's going to be, but this one in particular, it just seems like the evidence is incredibly voluminous.
Right.
Can we pare back some of this evidence, right? What is going to be admissible in trial? What's not? To sort of narrow the scope of like, right, what are the things that might eventually get in front of the jury? And so each side can make their sort of evidence-based case about the facts that happened here, aside from the law.
Okay.
In a previous hearing, the judge, the defense had said, listen, we'd like to break these two types of motions out separately. We want to first do our motion to dismiss. Spoiler alert, the big thing they're going to ask the court to dismiss is the money transmission charge. They're going to say, listen, even if every fact alleged by the government about Samurai Wallet is true and what these guys did is true, you've not properly alleged that they were money transmitters because they did not have custody or control over anyone's funds. And that's not what the Bank Secrecy Act means by money transmission. That's not what
Right.
Section 1960 means. And then if we win on that, then actually let's then deal with the discovery questions, because that will significantly narrow the type of discovery we need to look at.
Understood.
The judge said no to that, and now it's going to be an omnibus motion that's both of these things at the same time.
Okay.
So, the parties over the next couple months are gonna have briefs. The defense will move to dismiss. There will be a reply brief from the government. Then there will be a last response from the defense, and then the judge will rule on the legal issues, both on the evidence and what's admissible, what's not, how should evidence be presented, and then on this motion dismiss question, which is really important for people who are concerned about the precedent for non-custodial tools, which is you know probably the biggest reason to pay attention to this case. The motion dismiss will be important. It was the motion dismiss in the analogous Tornado Cash case where we got that really damaging ruling, where a judge said that the Bank Secrecy Act does not require custody or control to
Right.
make you a money transmitter.
Hmm.
If we get another ruling, in the same district from another judge in this case, like that's really bad. We are hoping at some point that the FinCEN part of the Treasury Department, the part of the Treasury that's really in charge of illicit finance, will put out guidance saying that they don't think that you can be a money transmitter without custody or control. I think if that were to happen, especially if that were to happen before there's a final ruling on this motion to dismiss, that will be really helpful.
Mm.
But absent that, I think there's a little bit of a challenge, despite all the sort of great movement in Congress and the great movement in the executive branch in a pro Bitcoin and pro freedom money direction.
Hmm.
Courts, judges are lifetime appointees, and they're a little bit insulated from that political process. And so I'm not sure you get the benefit here. And the only like really on point precedent we have for the Samurai Wallet case, unfortunately, is that Tornado Cash decision.
Yep. Yeah.
So we'll see that, the industry will write amicus briefs. We'll do our best there. But, that's going to be a difficult ruling absent some sort of statement from Treasury about their view.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate that. Regarding Tornado Cash, what happened today? What just got announced? Why is this significant?
Yeah. So there are two Tornado Cash. I mean, there are more than two, but broadly speaking, there are two sort of Tornado Cash types of cases. There are criminal cases against the developers that look a lot like the Samurai Wallet case, alleging that they were involved in conspiracy to commit money laundering, and that they were unlicensed money transmitters. And then there's also a case called Van Loon, which is about sanctions of the Tornado Cash smart
Right.
contract. So
Hmm.
OFAC, which is different than FinCEN. OFAC is the part of the Treasury that does sanctions, including on sort of foreign adversaries. They have the legal authority to sanction the property of foreign nationals. And they argue that the Tornado Cash smart contracts, the code running on the Ethereum blockchain, is property of foreign nationals and therefore sanctionable. There were these two cases that were both up on appeal in federal appeals court, one in the Fifth Circuit, the other, I believe, in the 11th, arguing that actually, at least specifically immutable smart contracts, are not property. Sometimes when people talk about smart contracts, they use an analogy to a vending machine, right? Just like you go to a vending machine and then you put in money and it recognizes you put in money, and then just based on code and not based on a person, the candy bar pops out or whatever.
Right.
That's how to think about a Ethereum-based smart contract. You pop in your ETH tokens, you get out whatever other token, and it's just based on how it's hard coded.
Yeah.
Now, the plaintiffs in the Fifth Circuit case in November successfully argued in one of these two sort of appellate cases that actually immutable smart contracts specifically are not like vending machines, right? Like if you're the owner of a vending machine, yes, a vending machine is property, and the owner of that property can unplug the vending machine. They can change the
Right.
prices of the vending machine. They can choose what's stocked in the vending machine.
Hmm.
They can choose where the vending machine is. And none of those things are true of immutable smart contracts. Once you've published them and you've privily burned the keys, you can't do any of that stuff.
Right.
And therefore, treating it as property is wrong. And the Fifth Circuit agreed with this. They were probably going to appeal that to the Supreme Court if the 11th Circuit came out the same way or a different way. But OFAC itself seems to just now have agreed with the plaintiffs in those cases. And today we got the news that they are just removing the Tornado Cash smart contract from their designated sanctioned list,
Okay.
which is, great. I think it's legally correct. It's a step in the right direction, definitely something to celebrate. But it's important not to read too much into it, right? It's good news. It's not like that good news. There's a lot of hedging language in here around, they still maintain all their sanctions authority to go after, actors associated with North Korea.
Right.
They're not making a broad statement that you just can't sanction smart contracts. There's still this question about immutability versus not immutability, right? If a smart contract is upgradable, if someone has admin keys, then does that start to look more like a vending machine that
Right.
is property? So all of these questions are still out there. But it's definitely a good step that OFAC is no longer sanctioning these things.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate that. Last thing, so I think it was you that set up the P2P Rights Fund. Some of the funds that have been donated, contributed to this, will go to the legal defense of the Samurai case. I spoke with Kion Rodriguez, one of the Samurai devs, after the hearing on Tuesday. He just expressed his gratitude to everybody who has donated. Just kind of curious as to hear a little bit more about our donations still streaming in. If you want to give a little plug for where people can donate, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you're watching this, please donate at p2prights.org. You can earmark those donations specifically for the Samurai Wallet case, as many donors have done. You can also send it sort of to the general fund. And what we do with the general fund for now, I mean, it's a couple of things. One is we use it to help do sort of low cost legal advice or education for Bitcoin startups. One of the worst immediate impacts of the Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet cases is it had a chilling effect and forced multiple Bitcoin startups outside of the United States. We want to push back against that. To the extent that there is a threat about these types of cases in the future, which could look like a criminal case like Tornado Cash or Samurai, it could look like this sort of interpretive guidance that we got from the IRS that would make front ends to protocols responsible for being IRS reporting brokers, and so then they have to KYC everyone. Whenever we get like a sort of court case that refuses or just doesn't recognize that in a world where Satoshi invented blockchain, right, and invented solved the Byzantine generals problem, we can have finance without an intermediary. The P2P Rights Fund, the reason it's called the Peer-to-Peer Rights Fund is we strongly believe that the law should treat those transactions as peer-to-peer, as non-intermediated, because they are, and shouldn't try and jam some concept of an intermediary, in the case of Samurai Wallet, the devs, where you're going to put obligations that they just can't follow and then throw them in prison essentially for publishing code.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've collected and distributed over $1 million at this point for the Samurai Wallet case.
Wow.
Donations are still coming in, but this is definitely an important issue, both because these cases are unfair and because if the precedent comes out the wrong way, it's really potentially dangerous to the industry as a whole. So definitely encourage people to keep donating both to the case and to the fund in general. And then relatedly, if you can call your senator or congressman to support the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. This is really the best solution to this problem, right? So it'd be great to get these cases dismissed or dropped. It would be even better to get a good ruling in these cases because, FinCEN has come out and said that here's how we understand the Bank Secrecy Act, and then judges agree with that, and now we have case law that we can stand on. Best of all is for Congress to pass this law that explicitly exempts non-custodial software providers from the Bank Secrecy Act and from this type of liability. That's the most durable long-term solution. So if this is an issue you care about, also definitely on the legislative front, call your representative, talk about the Blockchain Regulatory Certainty Act. That's our sort of like best end goal shot. And unlike the sort of market structure bill, the stablecoin bill, and to some extent the SBR bill, there's just less money behind this. This is more a question of like civil liberties and freedom than it is, directly helping people's bags. And so this is something where we need grassroots support because just the industry is not going to throw the same money behind this as the other bills.
Yeah. Zach, you are an absolute master at breaking this stuff down. Thank you for the work you do. I think as something that came to mind as we were just describing some of those dynamics with the cases, you said it to me outside of the Samurai courtroom one day. You said this stuff is not intuitive, and I have to agree. And you've done an amazing job at distilling what's happening for everybody. So we sincerely appreciate that. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for the work you're doing in helping to create this template, this open source template for the SBRs. We really appreciate it, and thank you for taking the time to come and speak with us about all this today.
My pleasure, and thanks for having me on.
The pleasure's all ours. All right, everybody. We'll talk next time. Take it easy.